Okay, so the title was More About Right Speech. And as we're trying to spend initially a month on each part of the Eightfold Path, I felt it was pretty daunting following two great talks given by Joy and Tracy. They both were great talks, and I really enjoyed them. So I started by looking at what the Buddha said about right speech. And this is admittedly a distillation, but this is what he has to say on the subject. Right speech should be well-spoken, just and fair, endearing, and it should embody truth and wisdom. It should avoid lies, deceit, and rumor. And the reason that we should practice right speech is that it is empowering and liberating. And thinking about that, the Buddha was around about 2,500 years ago. And 2,500 years ago, the language that he spoke is called Pali. And Pali was such an old language, it didn't have a written aspect to it. There was no written Pali language. And for about 200 years after the Buddha passed on, his words were carried just by an oral tradition. A lot of the suttas that we hear were made to be repeated line after line to make them more memorable. And when we read the suttas, we find that, it seems very, very repetitive. Things are repeated a lot. And that's because they didn't want stuff to be forgotten or missed in the long run. And then when it finally was written down, it was written down in Sanskrit. The reason it was written in Sanskrit is because it's a phonetic alphabet. So the people who were writing it down didn't even necessarily speak Pali. What they were doing was they were copying down sounds. And we still find languages today that are pretty much phonetic. One of the things that always struck me about the Vietnamese language is that although it is Latinized, there is only one way to spell any sound. So as soon as you know the alphabet, you can read. There's no difference in inflections that make a difference. But anyway, we have that difference. And then also, like a lot of, old publications, a lot of stuff that we see in, like the Bible and other books has been translated into different languages. It has been mistranslated. The same is for like the Buddha's words. There have been mistakes made. It has been translated into different languages. People hear it and try to be very accurate, but possibly their ego has come in somewhere. There's a lot of stuff going on. And so we don't know exactly what was said 2,500 years ago. We hopefully we hear the basic message. But then, in addition to that, we have our own filters that are going on. When we read the suttas, or when we look at the Eightfold Path, it's hard to look at it without our own filters. Our own filters being, our history, the predetermination that comes into how we see things, how we understand things. The ego, our ego has always had an effect. And in the way we learn language, we didn't learn language, like as children, we didn't learn like this is how we should speak and this is how we should hear, we just learned it by picking it up from what was around us. So language is kind of a sometimes thing. We try to be really careful about being well-spoken, about being just and fair, about what we convey as being endearing and embodying truth and wisdom. But as children, that's not how we learn it. So how have we learned from that, other than, beside what we're working on now? So we do try to avoid lies and deceit and rumor. Now that if that weren't bad enough, we have the limitations of language. Language can't carry all many meanings. English is pretty good. There are a lot of shades of meaning in English. A lot of languages do not have anywhere near there is many shades of meaning. I'm familiar with a couple of them. In Vietnamese, there are almost no shades of meaning. Things happen now. There's a will happen and has happened. That's it. There are no shades of meaning. Something is good or bad. We like it or we don't like it. We're going to do something or we have done something. That's about it. It's very simple. Shades of meaning are largely conveyed by context. Sorry, the phone just like automatically took over there. Where was I? Oh, yeah. By shades of meaning and context. And there's some of that happens with us also. We watch body language. That's part of the difficulties of talking on the phone. That's part of the difficulty of not sitting together in, face to face. We're not really seeing the other person, and it's hard to communicate as effectively as if we're face to face. And the other half of that is that the other person that we're communicating with also has all of that stuff going on with them. So I say that, like right speech and right hearing is a sometimes thing, but well worth pursuing. Now, the Buddha taught ethics as part of our practice, and speech, right speech as a part of, as an object of mindfulness, if that makes sense. We practice right speech and we try to practice right hearing or right listening also, but it has to be practiced, and that happens in mindfulness. Speech is tied to enlightenment. When speaking, we're aware, and when listening, we are aware. We speak with an agenda. We can't not. And we find that things are becoming much more polarized now, and it's more difficult to hear someone and to communicate with someone who isn't in alignment with us. I've been working on practicing with that, and a big part for me is developing the ability to listen to someone from a very different place. And I find that that's eased by first acknowledging what that person has to say. And then looking for areas where we can agree. And speaking from our truth and addressing ideas without looking at who the person is, without getting the ego involved, without thinking that, who we are we special? We're Buddhist. Are we special? Are we special because of, what we do, or because of our education, Or are we, just one of the 7 billion souls on the earth right now? So can we practice listening without the ego, or at least work on it? It's all, as I think Joyce said, it's all a process. We're always, speaking as best we can, and also we're becoming better at it. We're practicing it more. So how do we pay attention to our speech? I think by knowing what our attitude is, by seeing if we're feeling threatened by a conversation with someone else, and by looking honestly at our attitudes. How do they affect our speech? How do they affect how we hear what's happening? Listening is active, and hearing is passive. So the Buddha taught from what he knew 2,500 years ago. His speech was carried down to us verbally. And there are undoubtedly many errors, as we said before. And we should keep in mind that we don't really know how effective our habits of speech are, because we are only one half of the equation there. So as we are each responsible for our own salvation from greed, aversion, and delusion, we have to take it upon ourselves to find what is true for ourselves in our speech, and particularly delusion. I think that one is really difficult in looking at right speech. We see ourselves as, I think, uniquely qualified. We are under the delusion that we know what's best. We're under the delusion that, I like to say it, like, you think you're right and I know I'm right. There's a lot of that. And, like, if we see ourselves as special somehow, that's a delusion that kind of cripples right speech. Okay, so who do we listen to? Who are our teachers? Now, besides our teachers, being, like formal teaching, someone who is maybe giving a talk like this, or someone who we see online, someone that we're on a retreat with, who is the most difficult person that we deal with? That person, I find, has always been a great teacher for me. When I'm sitting there and I'm trying to hear clearly, and I know that I don't agree with this person, that's one of my best teachers. If we only listen to the people that we agree with, if we only listen to the people that we know are like-minded, we're missing the chance to learn. Not so much just about them, but about ourselves, about how we listen, about how well we communicate. When we pay attention to how we're listening, we're learning. And I find that the more I practice listening with someone that I disagree with, the more I care about them, the more I feel I can love that person. In thinking about this morning, my 9-year-old grandson came running into the house to tell me that there was a possum in the trash can. He went to spit his gum in the trash can, and he says he was terrified. There was a possum there. Maybe the possum's still there. But anyway, at that moment, I was looking through some stuff, and I found this poem. It's not attributed, and I'm not going to read the entire thing. If someone knows who wrote it, I'd appreciate hearing it. But the title of it is Toad. If that rings a bell, that'd be great. And so this is what I read there. I squatted beside the lane at the edge of the path. He didn't move. I began to talk. I talked about summer. I talked about the pleasures of eating. I talked about the terrors of night. I talked about this cup we call life, about happiness and how good it feels. I talked about the heat of the sun between my shoulder blades. He looked neither up nor down. It didn't mean he was afraid or asleep. I felt his energy stored maybe beneath his tongue. I talked about how the world seemed to me, about the blue sky all around my head. I said I wondered how it must seem to him, down there intimate with the dust. He might have been Buddha. He did not blink or frown, nor a tear fell from those yellow gold-rimmed eyes. As the refined anguish of language passed over him.